Hello, welcome. It's great to be with you guys today. It's always a pleasure to get to bring the word. And I would just want to say again, probably saying it one too many times, but congratulations to our graduates. We are super thankful for you guys. We are excited for what God is going to continue to do in your lives. And so, yes, now that you're officially graduated, we just want to say thank you. Yeah, can we clap for that? Yeah, a little, participation. So, yeah, we did recognize them last week. I'm aware of that. We had a combined service, and because of that, we took a break from our series in Mark, and Joe kind of laid out some things from Romans 12 to help us think through how can we continue to pursue and glorify God throughout the summer. And so definitely continue to think about those things, but today we're going to get back into our series in the Gospel of Mark. We'll be in Mark chapter 8 if you want to go ahead and start turning there. And to kind of frame our discussion for today, I want us to think about things that we hear over and over again, repeated messages in our lives. The thing that I think about when I think about maybe unnecessary repetition is on U.S. Highway 33, headed south into Athens. Right by the Fun Barn, just to kind of locate, you guys may be aware that there's this transition from where the speed limit is 70 miles an hour to where it's 55 miles an hour. Yeah, we're aware of this. It's tough because it's like you're so close and then you have to slow down, right? And if you guys aren't familiar, what happens is you kind of crest this hill, there's this like reduced speed ahead sign. And I think there may even be multiple of those. But then when you actually hit the speed limit transition, within about 100 yards, there's not one, not two, not three, but 4 signs that let you know that the speed limit is now 50 miles an hour. And those signs even light up at night. It's a little extra. It's like we get the point, but some county engineer was very clearly determined to get us to slow down there. And I think I've not actually talked to anyone about why that emphasis is placed in that particular speed zone, but I do know that turning out of the Fun Barn, yes, we go there sometimes, is quite difficult and potentially even can be dangerous. And just knowing myself, I think if there were less robust signage, many people would probably miss that transition or simply ignore it, which could lead to devastating accidents and backups in that area. I think sometimes it's easy to be frustrated by repeated messages, maybe to want to tune them out, but repetition helps drive home important things. And sometimes it's the only way to break through the distraction and general disregard that we can carry through life. It makes important things stick in our forgetful and sometimes ignorant minds. If you've been following along in our study of Mark recently, our passage today is going to be a little bit repetitive. Over the last 2 chapters in Mark, Jesus has fed a multitude of people in feeding the 5,000. He has crossed the Sea of Galilee. He has had conflict with Pharisees, and he has had a discussion with someone about bread. And spoiler alert, today, Jesus is going to feed a multitude of people. He's going to cross the Sea of Galilee. He is going to have conflict with the Pharisees, and you guessed it, he's going to have a conversation with someone about bread. So I think we could be tempted as we read today to tune that out, to just kind of blaze by this as we read because it's so familiar. But I want to suggest that that repetition is intentional, that there is an important message that we need to pay attention to, so much so that God chose to drive it home through repetition here in the Gospel of Mark. And so as we open our Bibles today, I want us to notice what is this story telling us about who Jesus is, and how is that actually impacting our faith? So again, we'll be in Mark chapter 8. You can go ahead and turn there if you haven't already. We'll start in verse 1, and we'll read the first 21 verses. The verses will also be on the screen. In those days, when a great crowd had gathered, and they had nothing to eat, he called his disciples to him and said to them, "I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come from far away." And his disciples answered him, "How can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place?" And he asked them, "How many loaves do you have?" They said, 7. He directed the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And they set them before the crowd. And they had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. And they ate and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. And there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away. And immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." And he left them and got into the boat again and went to the other side. Now, they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" They said to him, 12. "And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up?" And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, "Do you not yet understand? Do you not yet understand?" So this section, it features 3 scenes with 3 groups, right? There's this interaction with the crowd that Jesus compassionately feeds. There's an interaction with the Pharisees who Jesus kind of strictly, sharply dismisses. And then there's a conversation in a boat with his disciples that kind of ties everything together. And Mark tells us that a great crowd, to just start with the first interaction there, has gathered, and they have nothing to eat. And as he describes that, we get this window into the heart of Jesus. We know that Jesus is fully man, but it's not every day that we actually get to understand what's going on inside of, his perfect seat of emotions, right? And so I want us to tune in to what we see Jesus feeling. He feels compassion. Jesus had compassion. In the Greek word there, it refers to being moved in one's bowels. It's kind of a similar way that we might say today, his heart was broken. And I think this shows us something that's so important about Jesus' ministry and heart. Like, for how much attention was on him, for how the crowds flocked to him, his eyes were on the crowd. He saw their needs, and he was moved emotionally by them. And this is not like a one-time experience in the ministry of Jesus. It's actually something that we see several other times, and it's something that Jesus drives home through some of his most famous parables. The kind of Jesus figure in the prodigal son and in the Good Samaritan. They're motivated by compassion. And so the needs that Jesus is meeting as he walks around are different, but the driving force is constant. The motivation for Jesus' ministry to people is his love for people. And he wants to instill that in his disciples. I think that's why we get that. That's why he shares this. He wants us to have the same heart. And I don't think this is by any means the main point of our text today, but I think it's good for us to stop and ask, do we have that heart as we minister to others? Do our hearts break as we witness the brokenness in the world, the suffering and the needs of others that at times might annoy us or frustrate us? Do we actually have the heart of Jesus, compassion for people who are in need? Now, as the disciples hear about that need, they actually are kind of confused. They're like, what do we do? They don't seem to remember that just a few chapters ago, Jesus said, hey, this thing happened. 5,000 people, we have this need. And he fed them. You'd think they'd just be like, Jesus, can you multiply bread again? Can you do that thing again? And actually, for this reason, there's some scholars who believe that this event didn't actually happen historically, that it's either an invention of Mark or it's some kind of duplication that happened early on in the manuscript history that then kind of got just massaged into the text. Surely the disciples would know to ask Jesus to help here, right? And then they kind of look at the similarity between the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000 to corroborate that. And you can get into all of that. I want to wholeheartedly reject those theories just real quickly. One, there's a lot of reasons. First, there's some notable differences between this story and the feeding of the 5,000. We don't have time to dig into all those things, but they happen to also be captured in Matthew. Matthew records both of these events. Second, if Jesus can do this once, why can't he do it again? It's pretty simple. And then lastly, Jesus actually refers to these two different feedings at the end of the passage. And so I think to question that one of these things didn't happen is actually to kind of question Jesus to some degree. And so if this is not just some kind of thing that is created by Mark, then I think there's something about the reaction of the disciples that we can learn from. For all that they've seen Jesus do, for all the miracles they've witnessed, it has not clicked for them. They've failed to still understand who he really is and what he's able to do. Rather than allowing their experiences with Jesus to shape their faith, they're still thinking in an earthly way. And as unbelievable as that seems, don't we do the same thing? We see God provide for us in some way, right? But the next time we have a need, we're anxious, we're worried. We hear about God transforming lives through the gospel, but when we have an opportunity to share the gospel, we're afraid. Maybe we see God show up in a battle against sin, but the next time we're tempted, we don't look to him again. What is happening with the disciples here is something that I think resonates deeply with our experience of faith, that there's this disconnect between the things that we know about Jesus and then what we actually act out of. And I think this is the reason that repetition is so important, because we need our view, our awe that we have for Jesus needs to grow. And so one of the things that this story is meant to drive home is simply the power of Jesus. I think it's so easy to read this and not actually understand what it would have been like to see Jesus multiply food right in front of us. Ephesians 3 tells us that he is able to do immeasurably more than all that we ask or imagine. And I think this is one of those moments where we have to be we can't actually imagine, we can't fathom the power that Jesus displays here to literally create food to feed 4,000 people out of thin air and have an abundance left over. This is a testimony of the divine creative power at work in Jesus, that he is able to do this. Something else I think we're meant to see from this story, meant to be reminded of, we see when we look at the audience of this miracle. We learn that these people have been with Jesus for 3 days. They're likely out of food because they ran out of food. And some of these people have traveled a great distance, so much so that Jesus is concerned about their trip home. And what that shows is these people were deeply devoted to seeking Jesus out. And just as I've been reading and studying this passage, that has deeply challenged me. I think there's some, we have weird fanaticism things in our culture, right? People wait outside of restaurants for days to try to be the first customer. I think some of our students actually did that when Cane's opened up. People might, wait outside of a store for a Black Friday deal or a concert to get just the right seats. But even that is not the level that these people went to simply to be with Jesus. And I'm just asking myself, am I ready to be uncomfortable for the sake of encountering Jesus? Do we really seek Jesus in a way that we'd even put our health at risk in order to just simply be with him and hear him and see him? And what this shows, what this miracle shows, is as these people did that, as they stepped out in that faith, that Jesus met them, he cared for them, and he provided for them. And that touches on a theme that we see across Scripture, that faith moves the heart of God. Hebrews 11 says that without faith, it is impossible to please God. And so when we come to Jesus with genuine faith, where we lack, he is able to give in abundance. I heard it this way, that he is in the business of taking what is not enough and making it enough. We may give him a few loaves, we may follow him into some degree of uncertainty, but ultimately it's him who is able to multiply that and who is able to meet us with more than we expect. And I think that's something we need to remember that in life, but it also, I think, should impact how we read the rest of this passage, that we should see that Jesus is actually rewarding the faith of this crowd, that he is seeking and rewarding faith. Because moving on to our next scene, that faith is exactly what the Pharisees lack. Even in the way they approach Jesus, we can see that their attitude toward him is different than that of the crowd. You know, on the surface, they're doing something similar. They're requesting to see a sign for the sake of their faith. But really, we see they argue with him and they're seeking to test him. There's this attitude of hostility that they have. And they don't just want any sign, they want particularly a sign from heaven. And the irony here is that we're in a section of Mark that is filled with miracles that Jesus does. But the Pharisees in Mark chapter 3 already looked at some of the miracles Jesus was doing and attributed them as works of the devil. And so what they're saying is, Jesus, all that you've done is not enough. Please give us something that will truly convince us of who you are. That if Jesus did something unmistakably divine, then they would believe. And what they're doing is they're using their own terms to define faith in Jesus. And that makes them unable to see the reality that really everything he is doing is from heaven. When I go out to share the gospel on campus, I think one of the common things I hear these days is that people will believe in God if they have some sort of special sign from him. That if God reveals himself to them in some ways, that will help them have faith. And when I hear that, I kind of like to drill down on that a little bit. I like to press in and just ask, okay, so what would be a sign that would actually cause you to believe in God? What would that look like? How would you know it's truly from God? And sadly, most of the time, the answer I get to those questions is, I don't know. And sometimes even people are honest enough to say that there's actually nothing that they think God could do that could convince them to have faith in him. If you're in this room and you're trying to figure out whether you should follow Jesus or not, then I think asking God to reveal himself to you, even in special ways, is a beautiful thing. We should ask that, and I think, again, Jesus rewards faith. He wants to reveal himself to us. But there is a danger as you ask those questions that we need to be attentive to. That at some point, the request for a special sign, a special experience, these hypotheticals that we float out there of I will believe if, just set up an unrealistic standard that actually masks an unwillingness to believe the evidence that God has already given us. Now, we need to be careful not to judge these students, not to judge the Pharisees, because despite how our circumstances might be different, even when we have faith in Jesus, I think we do the same thing. We might say things like, man, I'll know I can trust God when I find that boyfriend or girlfriend. I'll believe God is good if he takes away the difficulty that I'm facing. Or I'll obey that command if he helps me be successful in my business or my schooling. And what those statements do is they make our trust dependent on conditions that actually revolve around us. And so rather than actually seeking to have faith in Jesus, we're actually putting God to the test. And so often when God actually does provide those things or shows up in another way, we're blind to it and we just kind of pass it on to another conditional that's down the road. Yes, the Pharisees saw Jesus, they witnessed his miracles, but they show us that at least sometimes our problem is not proof, it is the disposition of our hearts. And so Jesus is clearly grieved by their request, and he wisely states that no such sign is going to be given to them. And that may seem harsh, right? But Jesus is not going to play an impossible game. He has no need to prove himself to these people. And he quickly leaves. He just gets in the boat. And I think the contrast between Jesus spending 3 days with this eager crowd that got to see his signs, got to see miracles, and then him instantly dismissing the religious elite who are under the guise of doing the same thing, that's meant to strike a chord with us. That's meant to stand out to us. And so as Jesus gets in the boat with the disciples, as we move on to our final scene, he begins to reflect on these two interactions, and it kind of sets up a teaching moment with them. And what he does is he issues a harsh warning. He says, watch out, beware. And specifically, his warning is to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod, which is kind of a weird thing to say. I want to break that down because I had to spend a lot of time figuring out what that meant this week. And so leaven is a rising agent in bread. I know we have some people who probably got into sourdough over COVID. I was not one of those people. Leaven can refer to your starter. It can refer to yeast. It can refer to another fermenting substance. But basically it works in bread, in the dough, to cause structure to form. It causes the bread to lighten and ultimately to rise. And when you make bread, whatever starter you use or whatever leaven you use, the leaven forms only a small percentage of the dough. A baker friend of mine told me that he only uses about 7 grams of yeast with 500 grams of flour in his dough. It's a very small percentage. A small amount makes a big difference in causing the bread to rise. And this idea of leaven or yeast is a pretty common analogy that's used throughout Scripture. And it typically actually carries a negative connotation. It kind of serves as a representative for a polluting agent. That even the minor presence of something bad can produce massive corruption. And so despite the confusion of the disciples, Jesus is not talking about physical bread. He's using leaven as a symbol for the influence of Herod and the Pharisees. And so what is the influence that Jesus is warning against? Now, we could try to cheat a little bit. There's other gospel accounts. And Matthew refers to the yeast of the Pharisees as their teaching, and Luke reports that it's their hypocrisy. But I think Mark is trying to highlight something slightly different, the root from which those things flow. And I think that because Jesus lumps with Pharisees Herod. And Herod was not a Pharisee. Herod was the puppet king of Judea that had been installed by the Romans. But he was united with them in hostility toward Jesus. Actually, in Mark chapter 3, we saw his people kind of start to plot with the Pharisees of how they might kill Jesus. And so beyond the opposition of Jesus, as serious as it is, Herod shares something else with the Pharisees. In Mark chapter 6, there's this account of Herod hearing about the things that Jesus is doing. And there's all these different opinions that are floating around about who Jesus is. And Herod, he sets a stake in the ground. He's like, this is resurrected John the Baptist. In Herod, we learn how to this very complex relationship with John the Baptist, this guy who was a prophet who foretold about the coming of Jesus. Herod was intrigued by John. He would invite John to come and speak to him. He'd listen to him. But ultimately, Herod never did any of the things that John called him out for. And ultimately, he killed John for his own kind of political expediency. And that kind of becomes a pattern for Herod's relationship with Jesus. Actually, before Jesus is crucified, Herod wants Jesus to perform a sign for him. And so we see that he recognizes, yes, there is something in Jesus. There's a power there. There's something that's attractive, but he's never actually allowing it to impact his life. And so these groups, it's just like the Pharisees. They share an outlook toward Jesus. They're intrigued by him. They'll engage with him. But when push comes to shove, they're never going to actually allow him to impact their lives. They're only going to come to him on their own terms. And so the leaven of Herod and the Pharisees is knowledge that doesn't lead to belief. It's flawed understanding that prevents action. Their self-centered orientation, it blinds them and it causes them to persist actually in willful unbelief that will never be able to see who Jesus truly is, despite the hypocritical illusion that they're seeking that. All that Jesus is doing points to the reality of who he is. But despite the repeated experiences that the disciples have, they don't grasp that. Like they think that Jesus is upset with them for not bringing enough food on their boat journey, when like the one thing you would think they would understand from the last, few weeks of their life with Jesus is that they don't need to be concerned about how much food they have when they have Jesus, right? And so Jesus sees that in them. And he warns them against what Herod and the Pharisees have fallen into. They actually need to apply what they're experiencing to their faith. And ironically, they completely miss that. So Jesus launches into this slew of rhetorical questions, and what he's trying to do is to get them to consider what they have seen. His goal is that they would recognize who he is, because that is going to completely transform how they process reality, how they think, how they believe, and it likely is going to cause them to not stress about how much bread they have. And I think ultimately that's what Jesus is trying to do with us in this section of Mark. Like the feeding miracles, all that happen here, it's repeated so that like the disciples, we can actually take time to check our understanding of who Jesus is and reflect on whether or not we're actually living in a way that's consistent with that. It's like the flashing lights on the speed limit signs on Highway 33. Jesus is saying, I'm really trying to drive home that this is important. You need to grasp who I am. And this is Jesus' goal. Jesus wants to develop in us a genuine understanding of him that manifests an active faith. Again, Jesus wants to develop in us a genuine understanding of him that manifests an active faith. And so what is that understanding of Jesus? What is it that we need to believe about him? I think there's two things that this story points out. First, I don't think it's an accident that the motif across these chapters, that the theme across these chapters is bread, right? And actually in the Gospel of John, Jesus, around this time in his ministry, refers to himself as the bread of life. And the picture is one of sustenance. It's that there's so many things that we look to in this world to satisfy us, but there's a way that Jesus alone can satisfy us spiritually, as he miraculously fed the crowds, so he is able to miraculously fill us. There's all sorts of things we look to, right? Our ambitions, the affirmation of others, the fleshly appetites that we have, but these things, they never last. And what we see is that Jesus sees our need. He sees that we hunger for something deeper, and he invites us to truly be filled by him. So we need to understand that Jesus is our compassionate provider. Jesus is our compassionate provider. And on that note, commentators note similarities between how Jesus blesses this meal and how he blesses communion when he institutes it later in the gospel. And communion is the meal that Jesus gives us to commemorate ultimately how he has given us, something to remember, how he gave himself to restore us to God. Ultimately, Jesus saw our deepest need, that we were separated from God because of our sin, and he moved with compassion and did something about it. And so the question is, do we believe that Jesus is truly enough for us, both in the minute and the most important ways? Are we looking to him to be filled? Second, we see the incredible power of God at work in Jesus. I mean, this miracle is just insane, right? We need to understand that Jesus is the unlimited God, that there is nothing that he cannot do. And I'm just humbled as I think about that, because I know, there's so many moments of busyness or stress where I just revert to acting just like the disciples did. I try to do things on my own. I'm focused on my own limitations, when what I need to do is focus on him, who he is, not what I lack. We need a deeper regard for Jesus' strength. Do we live like he is powerful beyond our comprehension? So often I think it's easy to live like these things aren't the case. Yes, we may know them on some level, But in reality, there's something else that actually guides the way that we live. Like the Pharisees, like Herod, like the disciples, we actually witness the ways that Jesus is moving around us without understanding it. Maybe it's pride or distraction or uncertainty, but something clouds our view in our subsequent response to Jesus. And so we need to heed Jesus' warning against knowledge that is not resulting in faith. So I ask with Jesus today, do you yet understand? And as I ask that, I think it's important for us to notice how Jesus asked it. He asked, do you not yet understand? Yet. In one way, I think that's Jesus saying that it's reasonable for him to expect that for all the disciples saw in him, there was enough evidence for them to truly grasp that he was the Messiah, that he was the Lord of all, as we just sang. But in another sense, I think it's looking forward, that Jesus is going to bear with his disciples with compassion, that he sees the weakness of their faith and he's going to continue to provide things. He's going to continue to set up these flashing speed limit signs to cause them to understand who he is. And ultimately, I think this is kind of like the Fun Barns blinding billboard. He died and rose again. That is the ultimate pointer to his identity and his purpose that we need to grasp. He's given us an even brighter sign of his identity and power and heart that we need to pay attention to. So, what that means is that in our time today, we actually have better evidence than the disciples at that moment had of who Jesus is. Not to mention, 2,000 more years of history and all that have followed in the lives that Jesus has transformed. But that means that we must combine the evidence we have with faith so that who Jesus is actually impacts our life, that it actually changes how we live and what we do and who we are. And so we must consider today, for our own faith, how does it impact our lives? Is who Jesus is really touching and transforming everything that we do? H2O, what could it look like if these truths did permeate every part of us? How we would turn to Jesus to satisfy us, how we would seek wholeness in him rather than in the things of the world, how we would flee from the entangling power of sin to the one who forgives and frees, how we would be content in difficult circumstances of our lives, how we would step out in faith, right? How we would obey through uncertainty, how we would have confidence that he can do more than what we can perceive, how we might share the gospel and boldly work to see our relationships, our workplaces, and our city transformed. Let's allow this repeated account of Jesus' miraculous power to spur us on to greater faith. Let's look to Jesus in faith, relying on him, because he is what we need most, and he is able to do more than we can imagine. For help in that, let's pray. Father, we love you. We praise you for what we see in Jesus, that you are compassionate and you are powerful. And we ask just that you would grow our faith. Would you give us a deeper faith and a deeper awareness of who you are, not just knowledge, but actual understanding that transforms and becomes part of our life, that shapes the very things that we do and think about. And man, I want to pray for those who are in this room just seeking you today. And I pray especially that you would just reveal through your word, through this time of worship, who you are. And you would give them faith to respond to that. Father, we thank you for your patience with us. There's so many times that we know these things, but we don't allow them to touch our lives. We thank you that you see that and you don't just instantly cast us off, but you walk with us so mercifully and gently. But I pray that we would never abuse that patience. And so I just want to pray for our body here today, and I want to pray that you would give us great faith that manifests in the action of our lives. that as you deepen our understanding of who you are, that more and more we would look like you and we would walk like you in this world. And so help us. We look to you, Lord, and we love you. In your name, amen.